This is Deadly Truths with Becca. America did not just survive the frontier, it rewrote it. We turned violence into folklore, extremism into rebellion, and criminals into culture. Tonight, we're not talking about how Jesse James died. I've already done that in a previous episode. If you're curious, check it out. We're talking about who he actually was, before the legends, before the ballads, and before the lie. Jesse James wasn't a misunderstood outlaw or a poor farmer striking back at the system. He was a product of Civil War radicalization, trained in terror and preserved by propaganda. A man whose violence was excused because it was useful politically, culturally, with mythology. This is The Frontier is Dead. And this is the story America never wanted to tell because it proves the frontier did not make us free. It taught us how to excuse brutality and call it tradition. Before Jesse James held up a bank on a train, before his name became shorthand for an outlaw, he learned a more dangerous skill than violence. He learned how to shut off sympathy. Missouri during the Civil War was not chaos, it was permission. Permission to settle grudges, permission to erase neighbors, permission to decide in advance whose life had value and whose life did not. Jesse James was still a teenager when he rode with men who didn't fight soldiers, they hunted civilians. Men who didn't believe the war had rules, men who believed terror was the point. Here's the detail most people don't hear. In 1863, the guerrilla unit Jesse James admired rode into Lawrence, Kansas and executed roughly 150 unarmed men and boys, dragged from their homes, shot in the street, burned alive. As buildings collapsed around them, there was no battlefield, no defense, just spectacle. That massacre wasn't an aberration. It was training, and Jesse James absorbed the lesson fully. Violence works best when it's sudden, overwhelming, and justified afterward with a story. When the war ended, most people tried to rebuild. Jesse didn't. Because of him, the war had done something irreversible. It had given him identity. Violence was not something that he did. It was who he was. Robbery came later. Fame came later. The myth came much later. But the psychology was already set. A young man who learned early that cruelty could be reframed as loyalty, that murder could be called resistance, and that if you aimed your rage at the right enemy, the public would forgive almost anything. This is not the story of an outlaw breaking the law. This is the story of a radicalized teenager who never left the war, in a country that helped him pretend he was something else. And that's why Jesse James matters, not because of how he died, but because of what America chose to excuse while he was alive. What they actually were was a mobile indoctrination cult with guns led by William Quantrill. The Raiders were not an army, they were a permission structure. They had no uniforms, no accountability, and no exit ramp. Teenage boys weren't too young for this group. They were ideal because adolescence is where identity is malleable, impulse control is half-installed, and belonging matters more than morality. So this group didn't need discipline. What they needed was rage, loyalty, and silence. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. The playbook was simple: to find the enemy early, Union sympathizers, anyone who's not us reward the cruelty. The more extreme the act, the higher the status. Strip complexity, no civilians, only targets. Rewrite guilt as honor. If you hesitate, you're weak or disloyal. This was not chaos, it was conditioning. The Lawrence massacre was not a breakdown, it was the logical endpoint. Teenagers who had been trained to see violence as identity didn't suddenly stop when war did. They just lost the uniform. And here is the hindsight is 2020 part most myth makers get. This group of raiders produced a pipeline. They had Jesse James, Frank James, younger brothers, and men who did not fall into crime graduated into it. Post-war America likes to pretend these men couldn't adjust to peace, and that's comforting, I guess. It implies they were broken by circumstances, but they were not broken. They were successfully trained. This was not kids going off the rails. This was Lord of the Flies with revolvers and adult applause. And speaking of applause, let's talk about the adults. Local communities shielded these men. Newspapers softened them. Former Confederates praised them. Nobody wanted to admit that what they were seeing was rebellion. It was, in fact, extremist aftershock, because that would mean acknowledging something really uneasy, that teenage boys had been weaponized, turned loose, and then romanticized because their violence aligned with the right grievances. Jesse James didn't need to be taught how to be ruthless. The lesson was drilled in early. What he learned from that mentor was far more dangerous. Violence plus ideology equals justification. Loyalty matters more than legality. And if the story is told correctly, the public will do the forgiving for you. That's not frontier justice. That's an introduction to better PR. And here's the punchline that no one really likes. America did not fail to stop men like Jesse James. It liked what they represented, as long as the violence pointed the right way. What this man did with proximity, modern extremists do with reach. The battlefield did not disappear, it scaled. Today, recruitment doesn't look like uniforms or secret meetings. It looks like comment sections, private chat, inside jokes, and videos that start with, "No one's telling the truth." And this is where people miss it because it doesn't feel foreign, it feels familiar. Across the world, whenever adults want loyalty before judgment, they do the same thing. They target the young, they simplify the world into good and evil. It's so black and white. They offer belonging before responsibility, and they introduce violence after identity is locked in. Different countries dress this up differently. Different flags, different language, same psychology. Some places do it with religion, some do it with nationalism, some with history, some with grievance and nostalgia. Here in the US, we do it with free thinking and doing your own research. It's the same old pyramid scheme, just now the starter kit is a YouTube playlist. Online radicalization works because it doesn't demand obedience up front. It offers relief. Relief from confusion, relief from insignificance, relief from feeling left behind. And once that relief gets tied to identity, the exit closes. You start defending ideas that you didn't actually choose. You repeat talking points you did not think of on your own, and you feel personally attacked when anyone questions that narrative. That's not debate culture, that's identity capture. And this is where Americans get really uncomfortable because we like to believe this kind of grooming only happens elsewhere under harsher conditions with fewer choices. Every country that has dealt with youth radicalization says the same thing afterwards. It didn't look dangerous at first. It looked like mentorship, like purpose, like community. But the time violence becomes explicit, the groundwork is already done. Whether that violence is physical, or aimed at institutions instead of people. The truth is that when Americans hear comparisons to other countries, they recoil, not because the comparison is wrong, but because it collapses with the distance. It says this isn't about them, it's about how humans work when identity is hijacked early, and that's harder to dismiss, because once you recognize the pattern, frontier militias, post-war outlaws, online extremist pipelines, well, you realize the method isn't cultural, it's predictable. The frontier didn't teach independence, it taught a lesson we keep relearning. If you give young people belonging before accountability, someone will always step in to use it. That's not history repeating itself, it's called human behavior. With better Wi-Fi. The men who made Jesse James famous, well, Jesse James didn't become a legend because he was exceptional. He became a legend because the right men needed him to be one. Violence doesn't turn into myth on its own, it needs handlers. After the Civil War, the South didn't just lose territory, it lost narrative control. Reconstruction brought new power structures, new money, and a very unsteady question. What do we do with the men who refuse to stop fighting? Enter the press. At the center of Jesse James's image rehab was John Newman Edwards, a former Confederate officer turned newspaper editor. Edwards wasn't reporting on Jesse James, he was curating him. And here's how the machine worked. First, language control. Jesse James was not framed as a criminal, he was framed as defiant. Robbery was not theft, it was resistance. Victims weren't civilians, they were symbols of northern corruption. If this sounds familiar, again, it should. This is branding 101. Second, selective omission. Articles lingered on Jesse James's manners, his horsemanship, his loyalty to family. What they did not linger on were the bodies, the fear, or the fact that innocent people kept getting caught in the middle. They sold the anesthetic and cropped out the consequences. But then you've also got moral outsourcing. The press did not say Jesse James was right. It said you could understand why he did it. And that's the most powerful sentence in propaganda. Once people start understanding, they stop asking harder questions. This was not accidental, it was a business model. Outrage sold papers, romance sold better, and a violent man framed as a wrong underdog, well, that is irresistible. It definitely was for me. Especially to a country exhausted by war and desperate for a story that made the past feel purposeful instead of shameful. And here is the hindsight most people do miss. The media did actually use him. Editors like Edwards needed a symbol, a living protest against Reconstruction. Jesse James was violent, but he was photogenic and already trained in violence. He fit that role perfectly. So the press polished him, protected him, and when necessary, they just leaned on that myth. You know, the facts. Those will just catch up. This is the moment where outlaw culture stops being accidental folklore and starts being manufactured identity. Because once the story is bigger than the man doesn't matter anymore. And that is the dangerous part. Once America learned it could turn violence into legend with the right framing, it never stopped. We just upgraded our platforms. Newspapers became radio, radio became television, television became feeds, clips, and monetized outrage. Same formula, different century. And Jesse James was not the author of this myth. He was the raw material. A cultural psychology verdict from a historian's point of view would be Jesse James rose because post-Civil War America was fractured, destabilized, and actively searching for stories that could absorb guilt, loss, and contradiction without forcing a moral reckoning. The war ended in 1865, but the country did not resolve what that war meant. Reconstruction disrupted old hierarchies, redistributed political power, and challenged the social order in ways that felt to millions of white Americans, especially in border states like Missouri, it felt pretty uncomfortable. Violence didn't disappear, it changed form, and when societies experience that kind of transition, they tend to produce symbolic figures who can carry the unresolved conflict on their backs. Jesse James became one of those figures. From a historian's lens, the key is not the crimes, but the timing of his myth. His robberies occurred during a period of rapid economic transformation, railroad expansion, banking consolidation, industrial capitalism, and the rise of distant corporate power. These changes created real anxiety. Farmers, small merchants, and former Confederates alike felt dislocated by forces they could not see or control. Railroads cut through land, banks controlled credit, and decisions affecting daily life were increasingly made from far away. Jesse James offered a narrative shortcut. He was framed by sympathetic editors and later by popular culture as a man striking back at faithless power. This framing mattered because it redirected public anger away from structural forces and towards a personalized, emotionally satisfying story. Instead of grappling with the complexities of capitalism, Reconstruction policy, racial violence, audiences could focus on a single outlaw who appeared to be doing something about injustice. That does not make the story true. It makes it useful. Cultural psychology helps explain why this worked. Societies emerging from internal conflict often gravitate towards figures who allow them to reinterpret violence as meaning rather than trauma. James's image allowed Americans, especially white Americans, to repackage Civil War brutality as rugged individualism instead of political failure. The outlaw myth softened the reality that guerrilla warfare had targeted civilians that many perpetrators were never held accountable for. Historians note that James was rarely portrayed as attacking people. He was portrayed as attacking institutions. That distinction is critical. Violence against institutions can be romanticized. Violence against civilians, well, that's not so romantic, is it? So newspapers emphasized railroads and banks while minimizing the human cost. This selective storytelling created moral distance, making admiration possible without confronting consequences. There's also a racial dimension that cannot be ignored. At the same moment Jesse James was being mythologized, Black Americans faced intense criminalization, lynching, and state violence. This resistance, when it existed, was not romanticized. It was labeled criminality. The outlaw hero was a privilege extended almost exclusively to white men whose violence could be reframed as cultural grievance rather than social threat. This is not incidental. It shows how myth functions as gatekeeping, deciding whose violence can be explained and whose must be condemned. America needed Jesse James because he provided continuity. He allowed the country to tell itself that the frontier spirit survived the war, that resistance could still be noble, and that violence rooted in the past could be reinterpreted as identity rather than extremism. He helped bridge the emotional gap between a defeated cause and a rapidly modernizing nation. Importantly, this need was not universal. It was strongest among those who felt displaced by change and least inclined to accept the war's outcome. James became a symbolic stand-in for lost autonomy, lost status, and unresolved resentment. The myth did cultural work that policy and reconciliation did not. From a long view angle, the pattern is not unique to the United States. Societies in transition routinely elevate figures who turn chaos into narrative. What makes the American case distinct is how effectively that narrative was commercialized through newspapers, later through novels, and through film, and how durable it proved to be. By the time historians began systematically dismantling the legend in the 20th century, the story had already hardened into tradition. And the verdict is this: America did not misunderstand Jesse James. It used him. He was a symbolic solution to a psychological problem: how to move forward without fully reckoning with what had happened, who had been harmed, and who had benefited from the harm. The myth allowed admiration without accountability and nostalgia without responsibility. This is why Jesse James does still matter, not as a man, but as a mirror. Because whenever a society feels destabilized, it looks for figures who can absorb its anger, simplify the history, make violence feel purposeful again. And if the story is told well enough, the myth always will outlive the truth. You have to understand why the frontier myth still matters. You have to understand why it did what it did for Americans at a moment of profound instability, and why that same psychological function has not gone away. After the Civil War, the United States faced a contradiction it had never fully resolved. The nation claimed unity, progress, and moral clarity, yet it was built on unresolved violence, guerrilla warfare, racial terror, economic upheaval, and political retaliation. Reconstruction tried briefly to impose accountability and maybe disperse a little power. That effort collapsed under resistance, fatigue, and selective memory. What replaced it was not reconciliation. What replaced it was myth. The frontier myth reframed American violence as individual, reactive, and righteous. It stripped conflict from structure and responsibility. Instead of asking why violence occurred or who benefited from that violence, the story narrowed to who pulled the trigger and whether that person felt relatable. This is where figures like Jesse James become culturally useful. He functioned as a pressure valve. Economic anxiety caused by railroads, banks, and industrial consolidation could be displaced into a single outlaw. Political resentment from a lost war could be recoded as personal rebellion. Collective guilt could be softened into admiration for defiance. Crucially, the myth worked because it personalized systems. It turned abstract forces like capitalism, reconstruction, modernization into villains that could be symbolically struck back against. Violence no longer needed to solve anything, it only needed to feel justified. That psychological move never disappeared, it modernized. Today's grievance culture operates on the same logic. Complex problems are reduced to enemies and faces. Structural change is reinterpreted as personal attacks. Anger is framed as insight. Identity fused to opposition rather than a solution. The frontier outlaw becomes the modern truth teller, the patriot, the one who sees through the lies. The details change, the emotional payoff does not. This is why modern grievance movements borrow frontier language: freedom, resistance, taking things back, while avoiding policy specifics. Frontier myth was never about governance. It was about permission. Permission to be angry without being accountable. Permission to resist without offering alternatives. Permission to frame loss as theft. Historically, this pattern appears whenever societies move faster than large parts of the population can psychologically integrate. Industrialization did it. Urbanization did it. Globalization did it. digital life is doing it. The frontier myth taught Americans a durable lesson. If you can frame violence or rage or sabotage as identity, you don't have to resolve the underlying conflict. You can relive it. That's the connective tissue between the 19th century and now. It's not nostalgia. It's utility. Historians don't dismantle myths by debunking them head on. That almost never works. Myths aren't factual errors, they're emotional frameworks. Challenging them directly feels like an attack on someone's identity. Instead, you have to do 3 things much quieter, more efficient things. First, you need to widen that lens. You got to move the focus away from the individual legend and towards the surrounding systems: economics, politics, media, power. When you understand the environment that produced the figure loses its mystique. Second, you need to restore context that myths erase. Who was harmed? Who was silenced? Who didn't get a heroic narrative? This doesn't moralize, it balances. Myths rely on selective absence. History fills the gaps. Third, you gotta track repetition. When the same narrative shape appears across eras, regions, and technologies, it becomes harder to believe it was accidental or unique. Patterns demystify heroes faster than judgment ever could. What ultimately weakens myths is not condemnation, it's comprehension. Once people see how stories function, what they excuse, what they redirect, and what they protect, the myth no longer feels inevitable. It starts to feel engineered. That's the end game. Not to shame the past, but to make the machinery visible. Because once you can see how a society turns violence into virtue and grievance into identity, you can recognize when it happens again. And it always happens again. And I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer, folks. That's history doing its job. So we've talked about where Jesse James came from, who shaped his image, and why America needed him when it did. And that's the history. But history isn't the point anymore. What matters now is what that story trained us to accept. Because Jesse James didn't stay in the 19th century, he became a template. When people think myths die, they imagine them being disproven, exposed, and replaced by facts. That's not how a myth works. Myths don't disappear, they migrate. They move from one era to the next, shedding old costumes and putting on new ones, but keeping the same psychological job. The frontier outlaw did not vanish when the frontier closed, it evolved. First, he was an outlaw. Then he became the patriot. Then he became the truth teller. Different names, same role. Every stage, the myth offers the same promise. You don't have to fix the system to fight it. You just have to feel justified opposing it. And that's why grievance doesn't need facts. It needs permission. Permission to be angry, permission to simplify, and permission to believe that your anger proves your insight. And once that permission is grounded, that's how people end up defending things they would have condemned in any other context. The myth doesn't erase consequences, it reframes them. Harm becomes misunderstanding, criticism becomes prosecution, and opposition becomes proof. And this is why the story keeps getting retold, not because Jesse James was extraordinary, not because the frontier was unique, but because the pattern works. It works in moments of rapid change. It works when people feel displaced, ignored, or humiliated. It works when systems are complex and solutions feel out of reach. The myth offers something easier than understanding: a role to play. And every generation insists this time is different. Different conditions, different enemies, different stakes, but history just keeps changing the font. If the story feels familiar, that is not a coincidence. It is recognition, and recognition is not something that's always comfy, because it forces a harder question than who was Jesse James. It asks you, why do we keep needing someone like him? That's not a question with a neat ending, and it's one you carry with you into the next headline, the next outrage, the next story that asks you to choose identity over accountability. And whether you notice it's happening is the difference between history being passed and history repeating itself. To understand all of this and even why Jesse James was tolerated or admired, you have to talk about who he robbed and, just as importantly, who he didn't. In the decades after the Civil War, the United States was not rebuilding, it was transforming at a speed most people had never experienced. They were reshaping economies and concentrating power in ways that felt invisible and uncontrollable to your everyday citizens, right? Rates were set from far away, land was seized, credit flowed through banks no one voted for. This was not paranoia, it was a reality. But here is the crucial point. Structural power is hard to see and even harder to fight. You are not able to confront an abstract system. You can't duel a corporate charter. You can't rob an economic model, so anger looks for a face. And that was Jesse James. Jesse James's violence, by contrast, was theatrical. It was visible, but because it targeted symbols of power rather than demanding systematic change, it could be consumed as entertainment. And this is why outlaw myths flourish in capitalist transitions. They offer emotional release without retribution. They allow people to feel rebellious without threatening the structure that actually governs their lives. It's rage with a safety valve. And that safety valve, well, guys, it's narrative. By framing Jesse James as an enemy of the railroads rather than a predator within his own community, the press redirected attention away from harder questions. Who owns the economy? Who benefits from modernization? And who is being left behind and why? And those questions are dangerous. Myths are safer. Outlaws don't threaten systems. They perform resistance. And as long as resistance looks personal instead of collective, the system remains intact. This does not mean people who admire Jesse James were stupid. It means that they were human, responding to dislocation, resentment, and fear that the tools their culture handed them. But here is that point. Selective outrage is not accidental. It's how societies decide whose pain actually counts. And once that decision is made, myths do the rest of the work. This story endures not because the frontier was wild, not because Jesse James was all that and a bag of chips, but because this myth solved a problem America did not want to set with. It allowed people to feel oppositional without being transformative. It allowed resentment to feel moral, and it allowed violence or admiration of it to feel principle rather than destructive. History does not repeat itself because people are ignorant. It repeats itself because the emotional needs are predictable. People want belonging before understanding, certainty before accountability, narratives before solutions. And myths are very good at delivering those things. This is not about rejecting history or distrusting every story that you have been told. It's about noticing what a story asks you to feel and what it asks you to ignore, who it centers, who it excuses, who it leaves out. The frontier myth did not die because it was disproven. It faded only where people stopped needing it. When stories of defiance and grievance rise again, when anger feels clarifying, when opposition feels like identity, when complexity feels like weakness, what need are they answering? Because history does not demand that we be perfect. It asks that we be aware. And awareness is the only thing that ever breaks the pattern. This has been Deadly Truths with Becca, where the past is not romantic, it is examined, and the stories we inherit are only dangerous if we stop asking why they were told to us in the first place.